90s child, so that was my misspent youth. But for some of us, the hedgehog may well have been our first encounter of nature in the wild, and can be some cherished memories when we imagine the first time we've seen a hedgehog. I don't think anybody has ever seen a hedgehog and not just melted. It's just the most wonderful animal. But the media and the public attention at the recent announcement that the species is endangered shows that this animal is close to the heart of many. And it's a clear call for us all to do something to reverse this trend and not to let this animal go extinct, for children to continue to discover the wonderful world of wild animals thanks to one of their greatest ambassadors. So I just want to inform you that this meeting is being recorded. We're not live streaming, but we are recording, and we will be able to put this important message out to the public later on. And I will now hand the floor over to my two colleagues to the right, Mr. Sebastian Everding and Ms. Anja Hazelkamp, both of whom are honourable members of Parliament and from the German and Dutch animal welfare parties, and tireless defenders for animals. So, Mr. Sebastian Everding.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I would like to warmly welcome you all. I'm glad that so many of you joined us today to discuss this very important topic. We have gathered here to talk for the first time about an animal that, to our knowledge, has never been discussed in this parliament before, the hedgehog. In autumn and winter, there are so many decorations with hedgehogs everywhere. Hedgehogs with cute-looking button eyes, red cheeks, sitting happily next to pumpkins and apples, and they are so happy and lucky. And however, this can't be further away from reality. Due to the increase of industrial agriculture, we have driven the hedgehog into urban spaces. Moreover, we are doing everything we can to turn their new home into a death trap. We are building gravel yard front gardens, we are using all sorts of pesticides, our gardens are tidier than some living rooms, and there are automatic lawn mowing robots that are supposed to mow grass at night, but they are at the same time causing fatal injuries to hedgehogs and other small animals. Additionally, tens of thousands of dead hedgehogs are victims of trafficking. Is there anyone in this room who hasn't seen at least 3, 4, 5 and more dead animals on the street this year? Many gardens nowadays are hermetically sealed off with closed fences so that hedgehogs can no longer enter there in search of food. And let us not forget, hedgehogs don't eat apples like the autumn decorations suggest. They eat insects. And there the circle closes again, because there are fewer and fewer of them. In Germany, hedgehog is the animal of the year. But in October it has also landed on the red list of endangered species. Fortunately, there are thousands of volunteers all over Europe. In their free time, treat injured hedgehogs, feed them and enable them to survive hibernation. This costs a lot of money and a lot of time for the volunteers. This year, many hedgehog rescue centers have reached their limits and announced that they have to stop admitting new animals already in October, almost at the beginning of the season. My girlfriend volunteers at the Dortmund hedgehog station, where we have filmed a short but sad video that you will see later on. Every day there are people with 40 and more animals in front of the door looking for help. There are no exact figures on the decline of the hedgehog population across Europe, but depending on the region, it is estimated to be 30 to 50%. First of all, we have to collect reliable information on the current hedgehog population urgently. And secondly, we have to support people who are helping hedgehogs with the necessary aid. These volunteers invest a lot of time and a lot of money, fight for every single animal's life, and then after hibernation face the question again: should we release the animals in this world that is everything but safe for them? This is obviously not our main topic today, but I have to mention this issue. The African white-bellied hedgehog is allowed to be kept as a pet in many European countries, which is, in my opinion, unacceptable. We are talking here about a wild animal, and as such it belongs in nature and not in children's rooms. I hope that this breakfast will be the basis for cross-group networking on the subject of hedgehogs, and we all have to work together to ensure the survival of this key species in European countries. 3 weeks ago, we started our first initiative. 10 members from 4 groups sent written questions to the Commission under the topic "Drastic Decline of the European Hedgehog and the Need for Urgent Measures for its Protection." if some MEPs present today are not members of the intergroup for animal welfare yet, I would like to invite to join so that we can work together on other animal issues as well. And I would like to use this occasion to express my gratitude to the representatives of the intergroup that are with us today and that helped us greatly to organize this event, especially to Lea and Nick. And many thanks to my team, Trinka, Fabian, Robert and Paula. And a short note again, it's Paula's birthday today. I don't want to sing a song, but maybe we can say all together, Happy Birthday!
Thank you very much.
I will now give the floor to my favorite colleague, Anja Hasekamp, and wish you all bon appetit and fruitful discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Sebastian. Welcome, everyone. This is such an important event on the decline of hedgehogs in Europe. Of course, thanks to you, Sebastian, for organizing this event, because, as you said, it's the first time we speak about hedgehogs here in the house. And I was asked the question earlier. What is your experience with hedgehogs and how did you feel? Well, I remember being on a camping place in a tent, and I heard a loud noise, and I was thinking that I was under attack by a wild boar or something. You know, this sound is amazing. It were hedgehogs. They were fighting about my apples, which were outside the tent. So probably because there were insects as well, but they were in this bag and enormous noise. So they kept me awake all night. This event is not only important because we all like hedgehogs, but it's also important because there is recent alarming news about the hedgehogs and the decline, and that they are now listed as near threatened on the IUCN red list. Numbers in Europe have declined by at least 30% over the past decade across much of their range. And to protect hedgehog population, it's important to tackle the direct threats like Sebastian mentioned, urbanization, fragmentation of habitats. And under the new nature restoration law, EU member states are required to put in place restoration measures to achieve a good condition of habitats. And it also requires maintaining and increasing urban green space and urban tree canopy cover. So I think it is very important that we monitor the progress of the nature restoration measures put in place by member states, because hedgehogs will also benefit from this. And we, apart from the direct threats to hedgehogs, they are also, it's also important that we face the indirect threats for hedgehogs, and that we address them. One of those indirect threats is the widespread use of pesticides. Pesticides are detrimental to the insects that hedgehogs depend upon, and some of them may also poison them directly. And the decline of hedgehogs is only one of the examples why it was totally inconsistent, and I would even say ridiculous, that the European Commission withdrew the pesticides reduction law. And even though we are facing a difficult political environment, we should continue to fight for the environment outside and to get the pesticides reduction legislation back on the table. And lastly, it is of course of great importance that the hedgehog shelters are provided with more support. Dutch and Belgian hedgehog shelters have reported increasing numbers of injured hedgehogs. And again, there are a lot of underlying factors that are mostly interrelated as well. It is therefore of the paramount importance that nature, climate, hedgehogs, that we all use our common sense, and especially the European Commission to use common sense to fully implement the Green Deal measures, all of them. We need that, and I'm ready to fight for it, and I'm sure that most of you are. So thank you, enjoy this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic, thank you. Thank you both. Well, yes, certainly while vulnerable and threatened, hedgehogs definitely are not the quietest animals in nature. They make a surprising amount of noise. But I will now give the floor to our next speaker. We have a really fantastic panel today. We've been blessed. We have most of our speakers in person, and we also have one speaker online ready to join us. But our next speaker is Dr. Sophie Lund Rasmussen, or Dr. Hedgehog. She is a research fellow at the Wildlife Conservation Research Unit, Wild Crew, at the University of Oxford, and is an honourable associate professor at Aalborg University in Denmark. She's engaged in hedgehog research since 2011, with the primary purpose of informing hedgehog conservation. Now, Dr. Rasmussen was one of two experts invited to assess the conservation status of the European hedgehog and write the report leading to the recent status update of the species in the IUCN Red List for Europe. So, Ms. Rasmussen, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much. So, hello, I'm Dr. Sophie Rasmussen, or Dr. Hedgehog, and I'm very honored to be invited here to give the declining and wonderful European hedgehogs a voice at the European Parliament. What an opportunity, and it's so important, so thank you so much for inviting me. I'm just waiting for my slides to be ready. There you go. And is it to be working? Excellent. So I just wanted to provide you a short overview of the ecology of the European hedgehog. So hedgehogs are charming, popular, spiky, solitary nocturnal mammals. They are insectivores, so they eat insects and slugs and snails, but they also eat animals, live animals when they can get their hands on them, but also dead animals. Sometimes they eat fruit, and we're not sure whether they do it intentionally or if they go for the worm inside the apple, as we discussed earlier. But there is a way to investigate this. I have 800 hedgehog poos in my freezer. I just need the funding to carry out DNA analysis to see what they're actually eating. Hedgehogs hibernate, and the timing depends on the location, so where in Europe the hedgehogs are situated. My research has shown that the hedgehogs can reach an amazing age of 16 years, but on average, they only have a 2-year lifespan. This means that they get to breed once or maybe twice on average before they die. The litter size is usually 3 to 5 hoglets at a time, and the timing of the birth again depends on the location in Europe. One litter of hoglets, as they're called, can have several different fathers, so this is actually a natural way of preventing inbreeding, which is really interesting. Sometimes they get second litters during a season. So the hedgehogs are widespread across Europe, as this map indicates. But they were also introduced to New Zealand around 1870, and they are now considered pests on New Zealand, so it's a completely opposite situation. The same goes for the US islands, where they were introduced 50 years ago. My slides are not working. Yes? Okay. So the situation is that the populations of European hedgehogs are in documented decline over most of Europe, and on the 28th of October this year, something really important happened. The Western European hedgehog was upgraded, you could say, or downgraded to near threatened status on the IUCN Red List. This is, of course, very sad indeed, but it's also extremely important because now we have the documentation necessary to call for action to stop this decline. I was one of the 2 assessors writing this report, and I was very honored to be invited. So on the national red lists for the hedgehog is considered vulnerable in the UK, with an estimated decline of up to 75% in the rural areas since the turn of the century. That's 3 out of 4 hedgehogs gone in rural areas. And in the Netherlands, they're endangered. Austria, Norway, Sweden, Germany, Switzerland, they're near threatened. So it is a very worrying tendency. The situation is basically that the European hedgehog live close to humans, and a variety of human actions seems to be contributing to this worrying decline we see in hedgehogs. But also, I want to put your attention towards the increased focus on zoonosis post-COVID-19, or the focus on One Health and the potential spread of disease from wildlife to humans, and the other way around, because this may also lead to conservation issues for hedgehogs, because we're sharing habitats. So why are they disappearing? Well, this is down to habitat loss in general. We're building roads, we're fragmenting the landscapes, we're destroying natural habitats by building industry and housing. Climate change may also play a role, but again, we need funding to carry out proper research on this. The intensified agricultural practices definitely also play a role. And I want to bear in mind that this decline did not happen overnight. It's been going on for decades, so we are seeing the consequences of agricultural practices now. The loss of habitats, the natural hedgerows where the hedgehogs used to live. The heavy machinery may of course injure the hedgehogs. The monocultures created by growing one crop at a time does not attract biodiversity, and therefore we have a lack of insects. And the pesticide use in agriculture, but also our private gardens, is causing insect and slug extermination, so their food items disappear basically. And my research has shown that 9 out of 10 hedgehogs have pesticides in their livers. 9 out of 10. And we only tested for 19 different substances. This is very worrying indeed. The monoculture of plants does not attract biodiversity, so the hedgehogs have nothing to eat. In general, the biodiversity loss is a problem. We all know that the insect sects are disappearing, so what are the hedgehogs feeding on and surviving on? Are they surviving on supplementary feeding in people's gardens now? Traffic kills an estimated 1 out of 3 hedgehogs each year on roads. The habitat loss is a major issue, which causes the hedgehogs to seek areas of human occupation. And when our gardens look like this, like Fort Knox, where the hedgehogs cannot enter, where we only have short grass and tiles and no places for them to build nests, and this doesn't attract their natural food items either. What we need are wild gardens, where we let the nature go wild and invite nature into our gardens, and of course they also need to be accessible for the hedgehogs. So because the hedgehogs are now living in our gardens, a lot of garden accidents are taking place. So they get caught in netting, in litter, they fall into holes, also holes underneath trampolines, for example, and garden ponds, swimming pools. And even though they're excellent swimmers, if they can't get up again, if they're not providing with escape ramps, they will drown eventually. Then we have all the garden machinery that can injure the hedgehogs, the strimmers in particular, but also some models of robotic lawnmowers. We also have an issue with dog attacks in people's gardens. When people ask me what are the most important predators of hedgehogs, you would normally go for badgers, foxes, eagle owls, but actually the worst predators right now are the dogs. When we have gardens with mere grass and tiles and no nature, and you suddenly provide the hedgehogs with a pile of leaves and branches and twigs, they'll move into that. But that's because you've built a bonfire and then suddenly you're burning the hedgehog. This is also an issue today. So what is currently being done for the hedgehogs? As mentioned previously, the rehabilitation of sick, injured and orphaned hedgehogs is a major contribution to the conservation of hedgehogs. If the numbers are correct, an estimated 5% of the population is actually taken into care in the UK each year. We have conservation campaigns in different countries like Hedgehog Street and Danmarks Pindsvin in Denmark, informing members of the public on how to create hedgehog-friendly gardens. We have national hedgehog monitoring programs, basically citizen science-based hedgehog counts, but also systematic camera trap monitoring through the National Hedgehog Monitoring Program in the UK. But these are only national programs, and several European countries do not have these conservation initiatives. With my colleagues, I'm preparing an international database and record-keeping system for hedgehog carers, which they can use as a daily record-keeping system, providing all the information on each hedgehog's, their medication, their weight development, and this will gather evidence and inspire best practice. There are several rewilding projects that also benefit hedgehogs. And of course, from my point of view, the most important contribution is, of course, the research to inform hedgehog conservation and solve specific challenges to hedgehogs' survival. In the UK, the National Hedgehog Conservation Strategy was launched a few weeks ago. This was done by the BHPS, British Hedgehog Preservation Society, and People's Trust for Endangered Species. They engaged 30 different stakeholders in formulating the 6 priorities for hedgehog conservation in the UK. I was also invited, but it was a broad representation of all sorts of different stakeholders. Really important work. So what I do is basically to work closely with hedgehog rehabilitators, veterinary staff treating hedgehogs, NGOs promoting hedgehog conservation, and the industry. I'm actually collaborating with the robotic lawnmower manufacturers, and I'll get back to that. I also host an international conference for hedgehog professionals, making sure that people network, inspire best practice amongst the carers, presenting all the latest research to optimize the rehabilitation of hedgehogs. I also do a lot of citizen science projects and science communication, and my multifaceted research is focused on detecting what is causing this decline and how we prevent the decline. So basically, I'm informing hedgehog conservation through research-based optimization and advice on the subjects of hedgehog rehabilitation, legislation, political influence, conservation plans and initiatives, and addressing specific challenges to hedgehog survival. I'm currently involved in around 22 research projects, a vast majority of them concerned with hedgehog behavior, hedgehog parasites, and also describing the microbiomes and viruses of the hedgehog. So basically all the bacteria and viruses they carry to optimize the treatment of the sick hedgehogs in care, but also to prevent zoonotic disease transfers and inform authorities regarding One Health issues. I also want to highlight that I'm investigating hedgehog hearing for the first time ever now in a pilot project, because I want to see whether it's possible to develop sound repellents for cars and robotic lawnmowers, because this could be part of the solving of the problem. And I'm studying ecotoxicology, as mentioned before, and the ecology of juvenile hedgehogs in the suburbs, because I want to understand the threats they're facing in our gardens, since the struggle and the battle to save the hedgehogs is going to take place in people's gardens nowadays. So my work on hedgehog and robotic lawnmowers is a good example of identifying specific challenges for hedgehogs and solving the problem. So my research has shown that some of the models of robotic lawnmowers are indeed harmful to hedgehogs. I'm collaborating closely with the industry, with Husqvarna and Stihl, on a research project to inform and facilitate hedgehog-friendly robotic lawnmowers. We've designed a 3D model, a crash test dummy, which can be 3D printed and used by all the different manufacturers when they develop new products and test them before they launch them on the market. This can also be used in a safety standard test which we've developed to test for hedgehog friendliness, and hopefully this will be implemented as a safety standard for all the products, which will lead to a labeling system for these products, informing the consumers on which models are actually hedgehog friendly. I also run a conservation campaign called Denmark's Hedgehogs, or Denmark's Pindsvin, with the World Wildlife Fund in Denmark. It's been a huge success, and we have these annual counts of hedgehogs, and there's been a huge support from members of the public. They've helped us map the hedgehogs in Denmark. And on the first year, we had 15,000 people counting hedgehogs within 24 hours. And I want to remind you that Denmark only has 6 million citizens. This just goes to show how much support we have for the public, the potential for citizen science-based research and conservation programs. So these maps were provided based on the numbers. So we have actually now a beautiful map of the hedgehog distribution in Denmark. So I wouldn't be offended if you just forgot everything I just said. That's completely okay, but please pay attention and bring home these important take-home messages. We are causing the decline of the hedgehogs, and we're responsible, and we have to do something about it. We need to identify and document the factors causing the decline through research to target and optimize the conservation initiatives. So we need funds for a dedicated hedgehog conservation research program. We need national or even central campaigns to monitor the population trends. We need support for our international database because this collates information on threats to hedgehogs and inspires best practice for the rehabilitators. We need conservation campaigns to inspire citizens to create suitable habitats, hedgehog-friendly gardens, access in and out of the gardens, and to attract biodiversity, the natural food items of the hedgehogs. There are already campaigns going on, but several countries do not have the funds and the means and the resources to run these campaigns. So it would be great to have a centralized campaign. We need financial support and legal and practical frameworks for hedgehog rehabilitation to ensure the best quality of this conservation initiative. And I would suggest that we prepare an EU conservation strategy for hedgehogs as a nature ambassador, flagship species, because everybody loves hedgehogs, right? But everything we do to conserve the hedgehogs will also benefit nature in general. I would like to acknowledge all my collaborators and their staff and all the volunteers working on my research and all the funding bodies supporting my research. It's really challenging to find funding for hedgehog research because I'm competing with people curing cancer. So naturally, I lose. My situation is currently that I run out of funding in September. So if I don't manage to raise funds for my research, all these projects will be over very soon. If you want to know more about my research, you can follow it here. On my YouTube channel, I have a video explaining the work I do on robotic lawn mowers and hedgehogs, if you're curious. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you so much for inviting me today.
Fantastic, Ms. Rasmussen. That was, wow. I would love to see your agenda. I don't know how anybody has enough time to do all that amazing work.
I don't get a lot of sleep.
Yeah, and I loved the fact that you put the two pictures of the gardens next to each other, because personally I think that the wild garden is so much more beautiful than a sort of standardized garden that looks the same wherever you go. We do have time for a few questions and answers, so let's pass it over. Oh, sorry, could I just ask? Could everybody give their name and, well, we know who you are, but if anybody else is asking questions, please tell us who you are before you ask. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your work. It's very amazing, but it's so more horrible than I thought before. Okay, but my question is here, I counted it, 5, now 4 members of the Parliament in presence. We can reach many more about the intergroup for animal welfare. How can we help? How can we help organizing campaigns, making financial framework of the EU conservation strategy for hedgehog? What can we do as a member of the Parliament to support your action?
Well, we need to gather a whole network of different stakeholders, and if you could host such a session, like a workshop, like a 2-day workshop where we get everybody together, people within politics and conservation and research and hedgehog rehabilitation and so on. It would be really beneficial.
Yes, we will.
Fantastic. I think, Anya, you have a question?
Yes, I was just wondering, you mentioned that 9 out of 10 hedgehogs have pesticides in their litter. I think that's, well, I cannot even, I don't know what to say. It is amazing, this number. Can you say if it is only insecticides or also fungicides and herbicides?
So we tested insecticides and herbicides and rodenticides. The worst one was rodenticides. That was 84% of them that had rodenticides in their bodies. But we only tested 19 different substances. This is only the tip of the iceberg. But 9 out of 10 had pesticides in the system. And these were individuals, that was 115 individuals from all over Denmark. So it wasn't just one local area. And when we tested for the effects of urban and rural habitats, for example, we got the same results. So nothing influenced the results. This was a general tendency. And it's only the tip of the iceberg because we also tested for other chemicals such as pharmaceuticals. This has not been published yet, but we found very worrying results.
Thank you very much. And we have one final question, but we will be able to return to questions at the end of the whole event. Joe?
Yeah, good morning. Thank you very much for your presentation. Just Wake from Humane Society International Europe. Well, two things. Firstly, I was curious whether you think that the pesticides that are being used, are they pesticides that are used in, let's say, gardening, or are they the agricultural pesticides? And the second related question to that is you indicated that you've had engagement, which is fantastic, with the robot lawnmower makers. I was wondering to what extent you've also been able to engage with the agricultural industry with regard to pesticide use and what they can also be doing to protect hedgehogs.
I've not reached out yet. These results were only published in July about the pesticides, but I think there is a huge potential there. What we did was to select 19 different substances based on, they have like an overview of pesticide use in Denmark, so we just took some of the most popular products. We couldn't test for Roundup because it was a different method, so we didn't even test for this. But the amount of pesticides found was the same regardless of hedgehogs living in rural or urban areas.
Okay, thank you very much.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, my name's Ninja Winter. Today I'm allowed to give a voice to a small animal. During the past 15 years, people frequently rang at my door asking for help for hedgehogs they had found. I was happy to help where I could. One morning, I opened the door to go to work. On the doorstep, I found a box with a half-dead hedgehog inside. There was no message, no information, just the small, ice-cold, starving animal. No chance. That was the moment when I recognized that I lost my spirit. I withdrew from official hedgehog protection. I only looked after hedgehogs from my own garden. That was 2020. This year, I've returned to advocating for hedgehogs again. I've developed clearly defined boundaries for myself. I provide advice, public talks, interviews, and first aid treatment. At the moment, I have 3 cages with hedgehog patients in my cellar. I need about 15 minutes a day per animal to clean the cage, administer medication, and feed. I can carry out a number of treatments myself, following the instructions of the Pro Eagle book Hedgehogs in the Veterinary Practice. My neighbors donate newspaper for me to lay out the cages. When I need to consult hedgehog experienced vets, I bear all the costs myself. Medication, food, waste disposal, travel, electricity, water, telephone, etc. There is no support from the government. When I do the simple math of all these costs, I arrived at a sum around 140 euro per animal for a 4-week stay, without any operation or stuff what's needful. It would be much cheaper to let public and private gardens be more nature again. So gardening can simply be done differently, easier, and much more beautiful. All wild animal stations and nursing homes are already overcrowded at the end of September, October, and without the personal responsibility of the finders, nothing works anymore. Only a few animal welfare organizations have the expertise or capacity to care for wild animals. And there are also very few vets who support hedgehog finders or us. Even there are no possibility for the vets during their studies to learn something about hedgehogs or other wild animals. More emergencies are reported every year and earlier in the year. Small, extremely sick or still suckling baby hedgehogs, adult hedgehogs, as well as other surgical emergencies. This suffering, which should be a task for society as a whole, has been falling on the shoulders of volunteers, mostly women, for over 4 decades. The hedgehog is the oldest unaltered mammal on the planet. It has survived ice ages and periods of heat for around 16 million of years. Now it appeared on the IUCN Red List at level 2. We heard about that before. This is a dramatic change. Let me give you the bottom line on saving the hedgehog from my point of view. The hedgehog is a nocturnal loner, a pure insectivore. Its main diet consists of 80% large ground beetles. It also feeds other insects, small reptiles, and amphibians. The shell of bugs contains chitin. This enables the hedgehog to immunize itself against internal parasites, which it ingests through snails and worms. However, ground beetles are becoming increasingly rare due to the lack of dead wood in the introduction of herbicides and pesticides into the environment. Due to this threat, the hedgehog will become extinct in the medium term. We are able to treat parasites well, but when the hedgehog is released back into the wild, it eats the first snail and gets sick again. It's a cycle, so we should fight to protect the beetle. Back in 2017, the Krefeld study drew attention to the dramatic 75% decline in insects in nature reserves. So, for sure, all animal population that feed on insects will also collapse by at least 75%. Also, growing light pollution is playing its part. For example, 90% of the 3,000 butterflies and moths in Germany are nocturnal. The hedgehog also feeds the pupae of the night-active butterflies. So, again, a big problem for the hedgehogs. In the meantime, humans are making life easier for themselves. There are hardly any connected gardens left. For an animal that needs 20 to 100 hectares of habitat, a disaster. Gabion walls, metal fences, only invasive plants inside of gardens. Gravel gardens are created which further heat up the climate and no longer provide a habitat for insects. Modern lawn care is done by a robotic lawnmower, at night, quietly and secretly. Death on 4 reels for our nocturnal hedgehog. Any animal that crosses its path or gets in the way of string trimmers is seriously injured or killed. Sliced hedgehogs, severed limbs, scalped animals, cut off noses and lips, mutilated hedgehog babies. The survivors remain in the shelter of the bushes. They suffer in silence. Flies are immediately there, laying their eggs in the wounds and on the animals. Within hours and days, the maggots hatch. Once you've collected maggots from the eyes, anus, penis, ears, and mouth of hedgehogs, you will never forget the suffering of these animals. Ponds are filled in. All wild animals suffer from this, especially in times of global warming. When hedgehog mothers can no longer find food or water, they abandon or kill their babies. Only few hedgehogs die on the street. There are hardly any left. In Bavaria, the hedgehog population has fallen by 50% in the last 10 years, Germany-wide around 33%. Let me give you an idea of the 4 most important approaches to solving the problem you see here. And on the next slide, you see what politics can also continue helping here. Let me close with a final impression for you. The worst thing is when hedgehog finders contact us. They explain that they can't keep the hedgehog at home or simply they don't have the time for it. After all, they have a family, dog, cat, or they work. Yes, just like us. Then we are insulated that finders will release the hedgehog again. This psychological component is actually the worst thing. The ignorance and lack of empathy towards a helpless animal. We do what all human doctors have to do every day. A triage for a small life. 24/7. Thank you very much for your attention. And I wish you many special and humble moments with our little goblin in your garden. Hopefully for thousands of years to come. Thank you very much.
Very short on time now, so if there's any burning questions right now, we can take one. If not, we can take some at the end. Okay, I think we'll come back to the end then. But thank you very, very much, Nina. We're going to take a very short statement from Lynn Boland from Ireland before we move on to our next speaker. So Lynn, over to you.
Sorry, I didn't know I could give a statement, but just as a quick update on the Irish situation. So I'm an MEP in Dublin, and I used to work in a national park as an education officer there, but I now volunteer with the Hedgehog Wildlife Organisation in Dublin, and it's just to echo that it's the same trend we're seeing across Europe is that hedgehogs are in decline. Clearly, there's no baseline data for Ireland, so we've now initiated a hedgehog survey, but we're seeing a trend that certainly they're doing better in urban centres than in rural areas because, of course, of the industrial agricultural model. But equally, they're declining in urban centres. And one of the things that we have raised, and I was going to ask a question, is just around the metaldehyde, which is one of the pesticides that's used in the slug pellets. I had raised it as a question when I was in the National Parliament, and it was up for approval or reapproval in 2023, so I don't know if there's an update as to whether or not it got the approval. But the problem in Ireland, and I'm sure again it's the same in other European countries, is that you have these discount shops that, you know, everything is €1 or €2, and this is where you can buy these slug pellets, and, you know, the vast majority of people are not buying them to kill wildlife, but because they're so cheap and so accessible, that I think a very easy step to take would be at least to ban the use of these products for domestic use, and then we can try and tackle the farmers as a bigger issue, but at least in domestic areas they shouldn't be that readily available for people who just don't know what they're doing when they're putting them out. Obviously there's other concerns, like with the hedgehog rescue I work with, we have a WhatsApp group where we volunteer sort of taxi driving effectively. It's run by a veterinary nurse, so she takes the call, she gives the advice to people who find the hedgehogs, and then it goes into our WhatsApp group and we just ferry the hedgehog across from, depending on how far the distance is, to the nurse, and she then, a little bit like Nina, is taking care of these in her back garden and doing it all just through raising funds herself. So yeah, it's just to say that the situation is as bad in Ireland, but very keen to see how we can work together to try and, one, I suppose legislatively to deal with these issues, but also just to share ideas, like the robot lawnmower. I hadn't even thought that people would be using these at night, so that's something that I'll certainly be taking back to try and encourage awareness on it.
Fantastic, thank you for that really important update. And yeah, I just wanted to comment on some of the images in Nina's presentation. which I think we can all agree are just completely shocking and really bring to mind the importance of making changes, especially in some of the machinery that's used as well.
Small note that a telephone ringing all the time in one of the codes.
It's alarm, I think.
What's an alarm?
Oh, it's all right.
So who's not a morning person is their usual time to get on?
I'm really worried it might be mine now. Yeah, I think everybody's feeling guilty at some. Right, we're going to move swiftly on to Mr. Claude Welter. And Claude is the manager of the Wildlife Rescue Centre in Ostend, Belgium, and is very keen on networking to exchange experiences and improve best practices. And I think that's one of the things that we are beginning to do today, which is fantastic. He represents here his Belgian, Dutch and British colleagues who he regularly works with and who all face the same struggles on a daily basis. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It works, yeah, everybody is. Well, first of all, I hope to represent my Dutch and British colleagues. Belgians, they know I'm here. But thank you very much for this initiative and for the invitation. What can I add to these previous speakers? It's always a bit of a challenge, especially when you don't know them personally and there's little time for prep. We have everything between home rehabber up to a scientist that works on it. I try to be somewhere in between with my group and colleagues. I started as a home rehabber, and yeah, now I'm in charge of a group of 10 people running a professional center with 6,000 animals a year. So, but I can give you some data on the Belgian situation. I looked up, and in 2013, all the Belgian rehab facilities, which are around 25, spread equally over the country, they received around 3,000 hedgehogs in 2013. Last year, 10 years later, it increased to 12,547. 12,000 hedgehogs that were brought in. And we saw a little difference that was already mentioned earlier, that 10, 15 years ago, the majority of hedgehogs we got in were injured or babies by disturbance in the garden. So we knew what to do. These days we get very, very sick animals in and a high mortality rate. So we rang the alarm bell, and scientists started to be interested, university, government started to be interested as well, the Flemish government, because it's a bioindicator species. And so first they started with just voluntarily, the university was doing postmortems, and there was some fragmented research done as well, mainly several years ago on heavy metals. So I'm not saying anything new because it's very similar conclusions here. So heavy metals are piling up in hedgehogs at actually lethal rates that they don't even know why this animal is still alive with these high levels. They saw very high loads of different infections in these individual animals. Infections that they've always probably been carrier of, but it didn't affect the health of the animal. And now they really get really sick. And in Belgium, it's mainly the Corynebacteria that causes diphthery, but also skin lesions. And the third observation was very high, just sublethal concentrations of rodenticides. And what is worrying was it's the second generation of rodenticides, so the generation of rodenticides that should not be used by the general public, only by professionals. So the rat poison that is spread by or used by the cities, etc., that should be well protected and not spread in the environment while it's everywhere. That's what this research showed. Now so we get a lot of these hedgehogs in with skin lesions. We call it already the hedgehog disease. It's not an official name. And there is already a hypothesis that these rodenticides have a very heavy immune dysregulation and also causes skin problems. In the US, they have made a link between bobcats that live in urban areas, that live on the rats that they catch are the sick rats because of the poison. So there's this hypothesis that hedgehogs have a similar problem by eating slugs that ate already the rodenticides, or even eating the dead rats, because they are opportunists, so they eat dead animals if they find them. So there is already this link. It needs more research, and that brings me then back to your call, which is also on my paper. So it seems like after losing in the EU our megafauna, that we are now successfully doing rewilding projects, that we might lose another iconic species that you mentioned also. Everybody knows it, every child knows it. It's probably the second mammal that lives close to humans after the bats, which people don't know, but hedgehogs everybody knows because they see them in their garden. It's also a bioindicator, which means if things go bad with our hedgehogs, our environment, where we live, where our kids play in the dirt in the same garden, that our environment is in a bad condition. So one of the questions that was asked, what can we do, or what do we need, and what do hedgehogs need? It's very much the same as was mentioned already before, that the One Health approach. If the hedgehogs have a healthy environment to live in, we humans have a healthy environment to live in, and also all the other wildlife and animals will benefit from it. So that means with less pesticides. Is that difficult? Because we all dream of a pesticide-free world. Well, is it difficult? Yes and no. I can give you an example in Belgium. I suppose everybody knows the city of Knokke-Heist at the coast. People usually have quite large gardens there. And I was amazed to discover last year that there is a ban for professional gardeners to use pesticides, herbicides, any sites in those gardens. I was really positively surprised, and so I asked more information, and they said, well, we invited all those professional gardeners that are maintaining and trimming the grass, etc. And it's a ban. They will not be punished if they use it, but they have given a lot of information. They provided trainings for these gardeners and for the local owners of the houses and the gardens. And now nobody uses pesticides anymore, and they see that the gardens are even more, or the plants are stronger towards the summer droughts, the summer heat, because there's more vegetation. And of course it takes a few years that people say, yeah, my garden is dirty, I want a clean garden. But eventually there's a quick turnover in this idea that you need to spray all that kind of stuff to have a nice garden. So it is possible, and it starts locally, but I mean, why on earth does an individual person need all these herbicides and pesticides in their small garden? You don't need that. So what else do we need? As Sophie said, more research. There are wildlife rehabbers and researchers all over Europe. It's an easy, accessible species. It's just we need some projects, and the EU has this kind of project, live projects, and we are happy to participate. We're not strong enough to pull one, but the means are there. It's just, I think we need sometimes some help to be able to write a proper project. And as the last thing I would say, well, support your local rehab facility. Have a look where one is. There are always people asking, does rehab work? Does it work? You know, you have this individual, you feed it, you put it back into nature, and then what? Well, I'm happy to say that in Belgium, there's a project where we mark individual hedgehogs after release. We put some tags on the spikes and they stay for a maximum of 2 years. Well, we have a baby hedgehog that was seen a year later with their own babies in a garden. So it works. Will it save the species? No, but for the time being, it can help. And the last thing I want to add on the information on the African hedgehog that is kept as a pet. In Flanders, it's not on the positive list, so you cannot have African hedgehogs. For several reasons, animal welfare is definitely one, but then again, people might release them, you might have hybridization, and it might become a pest species, whatever. It is possible. Local legislation has worked already, and it takes a couple of years again, but eventually it will have effect. So I think the ideas are there. It's maybe very surprisingly that we all have the same conclusions and the same, we know what the needs are, and some of the solutions are already in place locally. So I think yeah, we have questions and answers at the same time. So thank you very much for your attention.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. I've been writing lots of things down because there are some very clear sort of guidelines of what we can do there. And just on a personal note, I represent Eurogroup for Animals today, and you mentioned the positive list that's in Flanders. I'll be speaking actually at the Intergroup event in Strasbourg next week on the 28th of November on the need for an EU-wide positive list. So we completely agree, and thank you very much for mentioning that. Are there any questions? We will be very quick with questions and then maybe return to questions at the end. If there's no immediate questions, then we'll let people think about it and we'll come back. But thank you very much, Mr. Velter. We are now going to try and view a short film, if technology allows, from the Hedgehog Rescue Centre in Dortmund, which Mr. Everding visited earlier.
Also momentan ist es ziemlich voll hier. Ich hoffe, ich kann ganz kurz und schnell meine Aufgabe beschreiben. Außen ist eine Schlange. Ich nehme die Menschen in Empfang, fülle schon mal eine Karte aus. Jeder Igel bekommt eine Karte. Und dann schauen wir mal, dass wir die Igel auch hier noch einigermaßen gut versorgen können. Und vor allem auch die Finder mit Informationen nach Hause schicken können.
Ja, so, wir schauen uns die Igel hier einmal an. Gucken, also ob sie Verletzungen haben, ob sie soweit okay sind. Sie werden gewogen, sie werden eingesprüht, wenn sie Flöhe haben, Zecken werden entnommen. Ja, wir machen also hier praktisch eine Voruntersuchung zur Behandlung. Es gibt natürlich auch Igel, die Verletzungen haben, also ganz schwere Verletzungen von Mährobotern oder von anderen Tieren. Es gibt auch Kinder, die mit Igeln Fußball spielen, also es gibt die wildesten Sachen und wir versuchen hier also einfach nur zu helfen, soweit wie es halt in unserer Macht steht.
Ja, hier ist der Igel Fridolin, der ist jetzt nochmal zu einer Kontrolle hier. Da er angefangen hat zu husten, was wohl auf Lungenwürmer zurückzuführen ist. Und deswegen hat er jetzt eine Lungenwurmkur bekommen. Die Dame oder die Finderin, Pflegerin, kommt am Mittwoch wieder und dann kriegt er die zweite Impfung. Und dann bleibt er noch ein paar Tage im warmen Bereich und kann dann aufgrund seines Gewichtes nach draußen in die Kälte gestellt werden, also kontrolliert natürlich, und dass er dann dort in den Winterschlaf geht.
Das ist hier eine Erstaufnahme, wurde mit knapp 300 Gramm gefunden, hat jetzt in den 3 Tagen fast 50 Gramm abgenommen, und da müssen wir mal schauen, was wir machen können, warum das so ist, ob das Tierchen was hat.
Ja, also diesem kleinen Igel können wir leider gar nicht mehr helfen, der liegt gerade im Sterben. Der ist schon ganz kalt und er wird es auch nicht schaffen.
Das war mal eine rechte Pfote. Ja. Das war irgendein schäbiges Gartengerät, was auch immer. Und damit ist der Igel wahrscheinlich jetzt noch tagelang rumgelaufen.
Wir sind eine Igelstation und haben in diesem Jahr schon 625 Igel seit September verarztet, versorgt, teilweise mit nach Hause genommen, wo man sich vorstellen kann, wie viel Arbeit das ist. Und es wäre wunderbar, wenn mehr Leute sich beteiligen würden an dieser Hilfe, die nicht nur viel kostet, sondern eben auch für alle viel Zeit in Anspruch nimmt. Das wäre super.
Video. Very, very sombering, very sad. But amazing to see the great work that the people are doing in these rescue centres, and we've got the representation today as well. So thank you. We will move on to our next speaker, which is my colleague, Lea Vedot. She's been working with me in the Wild Animals programme of Eurogroup for Animals for 3 years. She has a background in environmental law and wildlife biology, and she'll present today about the current state of play of EU policy and legislation for hedgehogs. That's also relevant for other species too, which I think is one of the overarching messages of today, is that many of the issues that hedgehogs are facing, it's not just hedgehogs, it's all of the native species that we find here in the European Union. Lea, over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for organizing this very important event. Sorry?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's okay. So yes, I will present on the current regulatory framework to address the threats to hedgehogs, but as we see, is clearly not sufficient. So this is not going to be exhaustive because otherwise it would take all day. But just to give some ideas of where we stand and identify some opportunities to improve the situation. So I'm going to actually skip that because of time and go straight to the threats. So on we have talked a lot about this already. The pesticides, the biocides that are used in gardens and in agriculture are very bad for hedgehogs. So I took the three chemicals that were the most found in the study that Sophie conducted in Denmark on dead hedgehogs in 2016. So, as we said already, it is not representative of what is happening, and it does not mean that these are the most harmful substances, but it can still give an idea of where we stand. So the first one is anticoagulant rodenticide, and it is approved for controlling rodents. It is found in it's blocks of rodenticide that can be bought. This is really bad for hedgehogs, but also it affects the welfare of the rodents on which it is used, because this is a very harmful substance for them. And what is important here is that we could think of alternatives to control rodent populations. For example, there is oral contraceptive. There is one that is actually already approved and used in the US. We don't know how effective it is, what is the impact on non-target species, etc. But just to say that we could invest funding in some alternatives like this for the EU to foster innovation and to create these safe alternatives that are also humane for rodents. The second one is a neonicotinoid, and the good news is that it was actually banned in the EU in 2018. There were a lot actually of emergency authorizations that were granted, but since a case of the Court of Justice of the European Union last year, now it's a lot more restricted, and as far as I can see, it's now only authorized in Romania. So hopefully, if we would conduct actually the study today on the hedgehogs, we would not find this neonicotinoid in them. And the last one is an herbicide that is used a lot in beetroot production, that is really huge in the EU, and I think actually it covers half of Belgium in terms of land coverage. And there are maximum residue limits that are set, but only to protect consumer health and not to protect the environment or animal health. So as we see, there is a diverse authorization framework for these substances, and as Anya already also mentioned, what is very concerning is that this year the Commission withdrew the regulation on the sustainable use of plant protection products because of concerns from the Parliament and from the Member States. But it's really important that there can be a new proposal that is also ambitious, that considers the precautionary principle, and also promotes integrated pest management, as it was in the original proposal. So yes, we will see what happens on this, and also to conduct research to better understand which are the most harmful substances, their impacts, and on alternatives as well. So the second threat that I wanted to mention is road collisions. So this is really bad for hedgehogs, but it's also, I found that 29 million mammals are killed every year in Europe because of road collisions. So this is really relevant for many other animals. And in fact, beyond the impact on animals, it is also a safety risk for the drivers, because of course, like for hedgehogs, I don't imagine that you would die in an accident with an hedgehog, right? But you can avoid the animal, and it can result in very bad, and can result in fatalities also for the drivers. So the EU is working on actually safe transport and safe roads, and has an objective of 0 fatalities in road transport by 2050. Fatalities being humans, as you can imagine. And there is also a EU road safety policy framework 2021 to 2030, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing about wildlife collisions in these. So it means that we are working on road safety, but not at all on wildlife, even when it concerns drivers' safety. There was a EU-funded project, but it was just to raise public awareness, and it was a really limited geographical scope. So there is no dedicated EU funding. So it would be really important to consider wildlife collisions in the road safety related policy, and think of funding for the development of solutions, because there are many, and Sophie mentioned some. So we can really upscale this work and really on making sure that this is implemented everywhere. And actually, there is a petition that is currently online, and I think it was launched 2 months ago. It's very recent, and there's already nearly 50,000 signatures, and it asks exactly that. It asks the EU to invest in making sure that the roads are safer for animals. On habitat loss, so also Anya mentioned already the nature restoration law, so I will pass very quickly on this. So it is in force now since this year, and it's really important that we look at the national restoration plans and make sure that it addresses the threats to hedgehog habitats, that the nature restoration law is properly implemented. And something that is also very important that I want to mention is that we should not only make sure that the habitats are fine for the species to populate, but also that they can thrive in this environment. That is really, it puts all the conditions for them to have their well-being guaranteed. And on robotic lawnmowers, so I did not know nothing about it, but I looked, and so right now there is no harmonized standard in the EU on this. We have voluntary standards that are actually not freely accessible. You have to pay to access them by Senelec. This is EU-wide. And they have standards on environmentally conscious design that are already published. But apparently there is nothing on hedgehog safety in this. What I thought could be an important opportunity would be the new regulation on eco-design for sustainable products, because there are going to be eco-design requirements that will be proposed. So if you can, we can see if there is an opportunity here to do something about the robotic lawnmowers, also the trimmers. So yes, this is something to keep under your radar, I would say. and also thinking of funding for innovation on the lawnmowers techniques for the manufacturers. It could be interesting, and communication of the EU on responsible garden management. So also funding for this could be interesting. Rescue centers capacity. So we discussed a lot about rescue centers, and we see the need. 12,000 hedgehogs just in Belgium is crazy. So and this is very expensive. So we need to think of the capacity for these rescue centers. At the moment, in the EU policy framework, the only rescue centers that are covered with some limited efforts are the ones for rescue, for confiscated and seized animals, so mainly from the exotic pet trade. But there are several types of rescue centers, and some rescue centers would only actually rescue injured native animals. So we need to make sure that these ones also have their capacity increased. So the idea would be to make sure to upscale the efforts that are currently conducted for certain types of rescue centers for confiscated species, to also consider the injured native wild animals. And I was thinking also, and on this actually, I wanted to mention on the capacity of the rescue centers that we could think of ways maybe to see if car users or manufacturers of the robotic lawnmowers could contribute to this, or even the ones who buy these robotic lawnmowers, like how they can contribute to the rescue center's capacity. I have no answer on that, but maybe this is something to explore. So. Then I was wondering, should we actually try to list the Western European hedgehog on the Habitats Directive, especially under the strict protection regime? So the thing is, the North African hedgehog is already listed there. And we can see here, so this is reporting data from Malta and Spain, which are the two countries in the EU where this species is found. And we can see that there is no, like the listing did not actually promote research on the species, and there is no clear data on their situation. But there is still assessed as a favorable conservation status. So, voilà, but we have no evidence actually that the listing did actually help this species. And in fact, if the hedgehog was listed under strict protection, it would be useful to prevent or to mitigate the deterioration or the destruction of breeding sites or resting places. And member states would also have to establish a system to monitor the incidental capture and killing. But these are not the main threats. So, in my opinion, if we would list the Western European hedgehog, we would tick a box, and the EU could say we are protecting the hedgehog. But actually, if we don't do the rest, like if we don't address the other threats, this will be useless, and this will just tick a box on paper and not actually change the situation on the ground. But this is my opinion, of course. It will not harm them. So voilà, this is just a recap. So I will not go through in the interest of time. And I just have a question, because we hear a lot lately in the mission letter, in the hearing of the Commissioner designate, about nature credits. So it seems it's going to be a focus in the next year of the Commission on biodiversity. And I'm just curious how such nature credits can affect hedgehogs, either positively or negatively. And I don't have the answer, but just food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Leah. And again, same idea, we are running a bit short on time, so if there's any burning questions now, we can take one, but we'll save them for the end. And we move on to our final speaker now. So, Mr. Frank Vassin is a policy officer and team leader in the Nature Conservation Unit at DG Environment at the European Commission. Besides working on the Birds and Habitats Directive and Natura 2000, Mr. Vassin coordinates the work on the 30 by 30 protected area targets in the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. So over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, a lot of things have been said, and I listened to all the speakers. There's a lot of interesting information, but I think that in the end we don't really understand what is driving the current declines of the hedgehog. There's so many aspects that could play a key role, and I would basically agree with, we know of course there's a lot of things that are driving the declines, but we really need to understand better what's going on. Now, the nature restoration regulation has been mentioned, that we believe this could be a game changer when it comes to the restoration of habitats. But what would happen if we manage to restore and the hedgehog would continue to decline? And I think that's the risk here, is that we actually invest into something that will not deliver the expected outcome. And therefore, I think indeed we would need to understand better what is driving the declines. And the question is, how can we do this? How could we set up a European research project for the hedgehog? LIFE has been mentioned. LIFE is a limited fund. Actually, we are financing projects throughout the EU, and it's currently oversubscribed. Of course, we have priorities that are, the species that are in the worst conservation status, those that are listed in the Birds and Habitats Directive. And we see that actually over the last years a lot of capacity has been created, a lot of people are able to carry out projects, more and more good applications are submitted, and but the funding, basically it's what it is. It's a relatively limited share of the EU budget, so we need to live with that when it comes to LIFE, and we have consistently said that we don't want to focus LIFE on research. We really want to focus on implementation. So the question is, how could we finance a research project? Well, we have Horizon, but Horizon is a program that is generally setting frames, quite large frames for biodiversity research, and it's almost impossible to set up a dedicated project for a specific subject like research on the nature. And the fear of the colleagues and the fear of DG RTD and the agencies is actually that they set up a dedicated call and nobody applies. So you need to be sure that someone is on the other side to carry out the project. And yes, actually that's the point I want to come to. Is actually it's probably easier to think about the mechanism to finance a dedicated research project if there is already a clear view of someone who would be able to take it on board. And I would like to mention, maybe a bit going away from the hedgehog, but I'll come back. You will understand why I'm making this diversion. A few years ago, a rather unusual application was submitted under LIFE with the idea in mind to identify hotspots of illegal killing and poisoning in Europe. And that project was working on the red guide. Red guide is a raptor. It's very widespread, like the hedgehog in Europe. And so in that project, about 20 partners from all over Europe teamed together. And what they did is they equipped about 3,000 red guides with satellite transmitters. And so each of the satellite transmitters, each of the equipped red guides at one stage died. And so the project was able to show what the mortality reasons were and where they were happening, location. And actually the project showed that there is still a major problem of deliberate persecution and poisoning in certain parts of the EU. It's a migratory species actually, it moves a lot around. It's not everywhere the case. That natural mortality is of course the main reason, then followed by intensive persecution and poisoning, followed by train collisions, followed by motorway collisions, followed by electrocution with power lines, and then at the very end, wind farm collisions. So actually, the good thing is that actually we thanks to this project, we know that the red kite is not so sensitive to wind farms. So maybe all these intensively managed agricultural landscapes where the only protected species is the red kite might be priorities for wind farms, rather than the other ones where the really sensitive species are. So that kind of information came out of this project. And quite curiously, there was another factor that caused a lot of mortality. It's red kites drowning in open reservoirs of manure, liquid manure. Actually, nobody thought about that. So there is all these just to say that we don't often understand what the real reasons for mortality are. And this is something we would need for the hedgehog. A European-wide project, because the mortality reasons might be very different from one part of the EU to another one. There's probably different combinations. I mean, the situation in Flanders might be perhaps representative, or it might be rather reflecting a very special situation of high levels of pollution, high level of nitrogen, high level of pesticides, what do I know? I mean, we just don't know. And in order to do that, we would really need to look at the European scale. So to cover the entire range and to better understand what's going on. So someone needs to design a project, someone needs to set up a consortium, and someone needs to provide the funding. And the question is, what could be possible sources of funding be? Well, life, I mentioned, it could be a possible source. But as I said, we cannot dedicate funding for the hedgehog, so there will always be a competition and no guarantee that you get the funding. The EP pilot budget might actually be a very good source, because there you can really dedicate funding to a specific project. But again, if someone proposes an EP pilot project for the hedgehog, on the other side there must be someone who is able to take up funding. So there is perhaps different other mechanisms, but I think this is one that could be very quickly set up. Now this is about the research, and I don't want to go into this up. It's really for the researchers to tell us how this should be done. Obviously we will not be able to equip hedgehogs with satellite transmitters and that are, kept alive with solar panels, like it is a possibility for big birds, but maybe there are other solutions. Okay, maybe it's an option, I don't know. It's really for science to tell us. And I think really think about setting up an EU-wide proposal looking at all these factors. And of course the one on pesticides is a very important one. It might not be the only one, but I think that's the way ahead. I think we really need to understand what is driving the mortalities, whether there are differences geographically, whether this can be explained by certain threats, but also what is driving the litter success, the breeding success. Because very often it is the mortality, it is rather the insufficient recruitment of the species, where the pesticides, the food bases might come into play. And we have similar examples with other species that are also suffering, like the hamster. The hamster is actually in a much worse situation than the hedgehog in Europe. And through the dedicated network of people working on the hamster, we now know much more about what is right. We haven't the solutions now, because it would require some radical changes in the way we treat our landscape. But the first thing, of course, is to understand what's going on, and then you can take the measures. And perhaps this might be easier for the hedgehog. Once we know what's going on, we could take some dedicated measures. If it's only about reducing pesticide use in urban landscapes, I don't know whether that's the solution. Okay, I could continue to explain, but I think that's the main thing here. We really need a strategy to set up a project. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those important comments. And I do believe we have some questions in the room. So we have plenty of. I've been told that Karina has a question. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I'm one of the area advisors for that group. And indeed, I was also already during your presentations thinking that this might be a very good pilot project that we should submit, I think, as the lab group. But I was wondering if you would then offer your help to write it in that way that it would also make it through the pre-selection of the commission, because I mean that's the biggest hurdle, I think.
You mean when it comes to an EP pilot?
Yes.
Well, I cannot I cannot say this, but in principle, I mean, there is obviously very good arguments in favor of such a project, because there is an obvious link to nature restoration, and the decline of the hedgehog is also very obviously an indicator of a wider phenomenon. So even though the hedgehog might not be at the forefront of our attention because it's not listed in any of the annexes, I think now what we see is that in addition to, let's say, the more specific species and habitats that were for a long time in our attention, we see that even in the, let's say, the wider countries, like the normal nature that we all used to see, I mean, the declines are ongoing. That the land use intensity, the way we treat the landscape, the new technologies, the new pesticides, altogether are creating a new level of pressure. And of course, we have as a common objective to not just to restore the species and habitats of the directive, but to restore biodiversity as a whole. And I think this has been very clearly expressed in the biodiversity strategy for 2030 and also in the nature restoration regulation. So I think this is fully in line with our priorities nowadays, and I wouldn't see any good reason to refuse such a project.
Fantastic. Just to let everybody know, we have 16 minutes before we will need to vacate the room. There is food, so you might have to grab some on your way out. But we do have at least 5 questions, so we'll try and get through them. But we'll go this way around, just so everybody knows. And so that's Joe, that's you next if you have a question.
Yeah, it was actually much in the same vein as Karina's question. I was thinking more about what the members of this house could actually be doing in order to get the kind of funding needed. So the EP pilot projects was also thinking maybe in the whole budgetary process of getting funds made available specifically for this goal. The second question I had was more regards with the Habitats Directive, what would actually be needed to get the inclusion of the European hedgehog on the appendices. There's obviously a lot of discussion at the moment about downgrading protections for other species, namely the wolf and other large carnivores, but what can be done in a more positive way of getting a species like hedgehogs?
Well, the current discussion is about putting the wolf from one annex to another in the directive. So it is still within the scope of the directive. Adding species to the directive is another level. So it would require a full legislative process from scratch. I can't say more about this, but I think this is very difficult and it's probably not worth trying, and as Ms. Bardot said, actually, it's not sure that it would change anything. So I would be very cautious about thinking about this idea, because first of all, in any case, it would take a lot of time, and we could go ahead much quicker with, let's say, the softer approaches, the funding. And yeah, I mean, the Habitats Directive, when it comes to strict protection, the original intention was deliberate issues and deliberate disturbance. It has been a bit extended by redefinition of what is deliberate by the European Court of Justice. Natura 2000 is about really the special areas in Europe, so we can't do anything for the hedgehog with Natura 2000. Species protection, I would also see this is a bit out of scope. I think the nature restoration regulation here is the key legislation for us to work in terms of favoring the hedgehog. And of course, the need to better understand what's going on. And yes, while the hedgehog is not listed, I mean, we had already in the last decade, I would say, an increased attention on species that are not listed. For example, under life, I think since 2014, projects are also eligible for, or not eligible, but priority for funding, if we are talking about species that are high on the red list. Now the hedgehog is not yet on the top of a red list, luckily. It is near threatened. But actually for a species that used to be extremely widespread, and to have it scaled up to near threatened, it means that really something worrying is going on. So it could be, I mean, this is let's say the prioritization of life is done by an expert panel. So in principle, you could have a project on the hedgehog with the argument that this used to be a very widespread species and the decline is worrying. But still, as I mentioned, you cannot dedicate a budget to the hedgehog, and there is a lot of competition there. So it would be probably more strategic to have, let's say, a dedicated way to finance a project specifically for the hedgehog rather than.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're going around, so Mr. Hefty.
Thank you, Nick. It's a little bit like the hearing should be with commissioners before. Sorry. I don't agree with the assessment that we need to know every detail of the decline before we maximize efforts. The details shown today are enough for me personally. We need to try to maximize the research, and we heard the pilot project before. Maybe we can leave the room later, close the door behind Sophie and you, and we can discuss the start of the pilot project, and then but at the same time, maximizing the research effort, we need to protect more nature, more animals. We need to help the hedgehog and the rescue centers. Thanks.
If I may, yes, I fully agree with that, but I think there is another aspect to research. It can help us to sensitize the public, to know exactly what's going on. And I think the better we know where we need to, put the screw, and
we need to do both at the same time.
Fully agree. Yeah.
Fantastic. We are going around to Sophie.
Yes, thank you. There is also another approach to studying the hedgehogs. I've just submitted a research proposal to the European Research Council about ecotoxicology in wildlife. So I actually want to unravel where this accumulation of pesticides come from. So the topic is to study all the different joints of the food chain, so all the way from worms up until the apex predators, to see where the pesticides come from, alongside samples of soil, water resources, and so on. So this is actually my way of helping the hedgehogs in understanding their pesticide accumulation, but to broaden it out to cover a whole range of species. I've also set up a project, gathered a team where we are going to equip citizens throughout Europe with little cameras in their cars to record all the roadkills on the road. So this is not only about hedgehogs, but recording all the roadkills by just driving around with the camera in their car, so we can pinpoint the hotspots of roadkill conditions for the different species, but also use it to map the different species, because if they got run over, they were there. But again, we need funding for this. But if we can actually pinpoint the hotspots, we can then prevent the road collisions in the future. And this is not only about hedgehogs, it covers a whole lot of species. So this would also be a way into getting funding if you don't want to only focus on the hedgehogs.
Okay, so we just do you still have a question? Yeah, so we'll go around, and then we have a question online, and then we have one final question then from Anya. So we have 7 minutes, so we'll keep them quite quick.
Thank you. I'm glad to say that as a rehab facility, we often try to collaborate with scientific research projects. One of the major hurdles is time, and universities typically have time for granted. So they ask us, can you provide us with X amount of dead animals from this or that species? I mean, we have a freezer full of dead hedgehogs that will, on a regular basis, go to the university, but there's never a budget for it. So even universities think, we have facilities, they're there, they can provide us with dead animals. But we have to label them, we have to bring their history in a database. So whatever project you do, I don't say you have to fund the rehab facilities to feed the animals, but at least provide some funding for the staff that needs to collect the data and the carcasses that you need for the next step in the research. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you for that. Over to you.
I'm going to introduce myself. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ziva. Hi, my name is Sebastian. Also, I need to apologize in advance. I'm from the Rhineland, and our main condition is that we just say what we think without any regard to diplomatic behavior, I think. So, Mr. Russen, I must say I'm shocked a little bit because we have now 1 hour, and I think my colleague already mentioned, or Elizabeth, we have 1 hour of information. What is the problem with the declining hedgehog population? And now I'm wondering, how can you then say we need to do research? For me, it's pretty clear. We have factors that are problems for every animals, like the pollution of the environment, the Flächenversiegelung, sealing of areas. And then we have special problems like the lawnmowers who hurt small animals, the pollution of the feeding. So I don't see how research now is the thing that is needed. And then you also said that when we do research, we educate the public and we raise awareness. So I would then like to ask, with really all due respect, do you really think that anyone outside the EU bubble reads EU research publications? And I can tell you the answer is no. So why don't you think we should act now and, I don't know, finance these saving stations instead, or programs? Why research?
Good question, but the reality is that we don't really understand what is the ultimate kick for the hedgehog. What is killing I mean, we have roadkills for 30 years, 50 years perhaps more. In my youth, I saw a lot of dead hedgehogs on the street. Now they're gone. So something has changed. I'm coming from an area where hardly any pesticide use is taking place because it's all grasslands. Well, maybe the rodenticides, that might be the factor. But we don't know which pesticide is driving the decline. It might be the garden ones, it might be the rodenticides, it might be something outside of the pesticide. We believe that we know it all. It's unfortunately not the case. And we've seen it very well, for example, with the example I showed with the red kite. So I know that there is always the argument that if we do research, we can use this as an argument to delay actions. And I think the remark was done that we shouldn't use that to delay action, that we have to act at the same time. But in fact, I don't want to go into controversy here. In my area, I'm coming from the Ardennes. The hedgehog started to decline when the eagle owl came. And I'm an ornithologist, and in fact what we noticed that each time an eagle owl established a territory, we suddenly found a lot of hedgehogs under the nest. And then after 1 year or two, it stopped. So what was happening? The eagle owl emptied its territory from hedgehogs, because hedgehogs are very easy to catch. And suddenly there is no more eagle owls in the Ardennes, no more hedgehogs in the Ardennes. Now in Flanders, obviously there is no eagle owls, or very few. So while decline might be driven in one part of Europe, actually by the arrival, the return of a natural predator, in another this is obviously not the case. So claiming that we have understood it is absolutely wrong. And there is so many different factors that might play. And if we look at the European scale, we might find totally different factors playing than when we look at the level of landers or the level of an individual city. And I think we really need to, and this is an inconvenient truth, we still need to understand better what's going on.
But there are factors that are the same in all of Europe. Like, example, the lawn machines, the lawn robots. You could right now start legislation that says every lawn robot in Europe needs to have an AI integrated that detects small animals and stops whenever it comes across.
Yes.
So if you say, oh, of course there are uncertainties, and of course there are different regional factors, but we already know that there are some European-wide factors, so why don't we tackle these, and then we research for the rest?
As I said, I mean, I don't say we should kind of put one against the other. there is no reason to delay actions. But we can take a lot of actions and we might be disappointed that it doesn't work. So
let's try.
Yeah, absolutely.
We have to lose a lot of effort.
That's exactly the point. I mean, there is no reason to delay action. But in fact, I think this is the essence of the nature restoration regulation, is that we want to take action beyond, let's say, the special nature that is covered by the Birds and Habitats Directive. But I'm telling you, I'm quite convinced, and I'm a wildlife biologist, I'm quite convinced that we might not be sure about the outcome. That's the we can discuss this for a long time. There's many examples where actually we discovered that the actual reasons for decline are totally different from the ones that we thought so far were the case. Yes.
I think if we do have any further questions, we may have to take them just outside after the meeting. But we have started today. I'm very sorry, Ninia, who's online, and I know that you had a question as well. But what we can do is we can put your question, if you send it to us in writing, then we'll be able to ask it, and hopefully we can get a response after the meeting at some point. But I think in the interest of not upsetting the people who are potentially coming into the room, we will close the meeting today, and I'll just give the floor to Mr. Everding for final remarks.
Thank you very much. And I need to say it very short. Thank you for your participation. I'm very sure that this will be the start of a much more larger initiative to help the hedgehog all over Europe. Thank you very much. We need to stay in contact, and let's go helping the little spiky animals.